Asked Arthur McEwen.
Not the other Arthur McEwen.
The real Arthur McEwen.
Okay, so well, welcome everyone. I'm delighted to announce the very first LAMSIG webinar presented by George Pickering, who many of you already know, but George was for many years the chair of the Management SIG committee. He is a coach, consultant, trainer, manager, and you'll have seen his name on many articles about ELT management. And without further ado, I'll hand over to George. If you want to respond or you have questions or comments as George presents, do so in the presenter chat window, which is below where my face is right now on your screen. And we'll hopefully, if we have time at the end, George will be able to pick up on any questions you have going through. But I'm going to bow out now and leave the floor to George. And welcome everyone.
Yes, welcome everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good middle of the night, depending upon where you are. It's a great pleasure to be doing this webinar. And you can see on the screen in front of you, you've got my name, you've got my email address, and you've also got the website of LAMSIG, Leadership and Management SIG. And I want to start by saying a very big thank you to Andy, the moderator, for sorting all this out. Anything that goes wrong is not Andy's fault, it's entirely mine. So thank you to you for coming along on a Thursday afternoon where I can imagine you've got lots of other things to do. And I hope over the next hour or so, we're going to discuss how managers can do research and why it's so important that more managers do research, and those of us that do it a little bit do it more often, and those of us that do it informally perhaps do it a little bit more formally. So this is the menu for the next hour or so. I'm going to start with a little story involving Sherlock Holmes and seeing what isn't there. Discuss what do we mean by management research, to give you a couple of examples of management research, then to try a bit of fast and dirty research on this call, to spend some time thinking about, well, why should we do management research, thinking about what are the conditions for doing it more regularly and effectively, and a very basic model for helping managers to do their own action research. So who are you? I think most of the names on the call are very familiar to me, and it's great we've got what I'd call a quality audience rather than a quantity one. And with a bit of help from Andy, we're going to ask you a very simple question about why you are on the call. Over to you, Andy. So the idea is that you vote on, just to let us know and this is for me one of those tumbleweed moments. Okay, so most people then, it seems, well, everybody's interested in research because the fourth option was none of the above. And most people would actually be interested in encouraging themselves and others to do research. Okay, thank you very much for that little bit of feedback. I'm going to start by talking about Sherlock Holmes and one of his stories called Silver Blaze, which is actually a story about a racehorse that was disappeared, so to speak. And this is part of the dialogue between Inspector Gregory and Holmes. Gregory says, "Is there any point to which you want to draw my attention?" Holmes replied, "To the curious incident of the dog in the night." Gregory said, "The dog did nothing in the night." And Holmes said that was the curious incident. And it occurred to me not so long ago that having attended numerous conferences, both general ELT conferences and management conferences, that I found that if I summed it all up, there were very few examples of people presenting the results of their management research. And I know as someone who edits a newsletter, how difficult it is to get newsletter copy from people, from managers about their research. So it did strike me that, this was something that we could do something about, something that we could address. So the whole point of this talk is to encourage people, managers, to do research, so that we will have lots of barking managers at conferences in the future. And this was a question I posed at a conference, the English UK Management Conference in Bristol early this year. Are management researchers an endangered species? Because, as I've said, if you look at newsletters and journals, you'll find relatively few articles about management research. One of the reasons might well be, of course, that managers tend to have less time than they would like in their working lives, and therefore not perhaps time to do formal research. There's also perhaps in some cases a lack of resources. People don't know where to go for the resources they need. There's also the possibility that research for managers isn't sexy or managementy, if I can use that word. And in fact, I looked at some of the Bibles of ELT management. I looked at from teacher to manager, and managing in English language teaching. And in both cases, no mention is actually made of actual management research, even though there are certain activities in the book which point out managers finding out about things. The last point I want to make is that as I go from conference to conference, I also find increasingly a focus on teachers doing research, but not managers. And I feel it's time we redress that balance. Because I don't think there's ever been a greater need for management research. As someone said, we all live in the prison of our own ideas. And sometimes being a manager, particularly perhaps being a senior manager, can be quite a lonely occupation. And we really do need to be tapping into the ideas and the experiences of others to make ourselves and the organizations that we work for as effective as possible. And with regards to teacher research, if we think it is so important that teachers do research, doesn't the same apply to managers? As Francis Bacon almost said several hundred years ago, if you give good advice, you build with one hand. If you give good advice and example, you build with both. But if you give good advice and bad example, you build with one hand and pull down with the other. So I almost think if we want other people to do research and if we want to encourage them to do it, then we should be doing it ourselves. And I'd like to just try a very simple thought experiment at this moment. And this involves you closing your eyes. Now, perhaps you don't know this, but this is a reverse webcam that I've got, so I can actually see you. I can see you. Yes, I can see you, Anne. I can see you, Arthur. I can see you, Catherine. So what I'd like you to do is just to close your eyes and relax. Okay? Close your eyes and relax. Keep your eyes closed. And what I'd like you to do is to see in your mind's eye the image of a researcher. Someone who's doing research. Okay? And see what that person is doing. Okay? So you can close your eyes, come back into the room. And what did you see? What did you see in your mind when you thought of a researcher? I'm just wondering, did you see a kind of laboratory situation? Maybe you saw a famous English language teaching researcher like David Graddle? Or did you see managers like these? These are all people who have been on the Delta course, a course run in the United Kingdom, and as part of that course, they've done some own management research. I think the point I'm making here is, and I really don't know what you did see, is that we sometimes think of research as being done by people who are completely different from us. We sometimes think it's done by people who have research as a full-time occupation, when in fact research is something that can be done by people like you and I, and it doesn't take necessarily as long as we might imagine. So what do we mean by research? I'm going to give a couple of traditional definitions of this before attempting one for management research. So Bass's definition here talks about research being systematic, critical, and self-critical inquiry which aims to contribute to the advancement of knowledge. And I particularly like the fact that it talks about being self-critical, perhaps about one's own performance and also about the way one carries out the research. But notice that the focus here is on the advancement of knowledge. Let's try another definition, which comes from Allwright and Hanks. And they're referring to practitioner research. As it says at the top, this is research carried out by teachers and managers rather than full-time researchers. And they say practitioner research involves two conceptually distinct processes: taking action for understanding and taking action for change. And notice the shift of emphasis here. It's not just research for research's sake, it's become research in order to transform the world in some way or another. And following on from that, we have the quotation from Allwright and Hanks seeking to define action research, where they say action research starts out with an intention to change in order to solve a problem or to introduce an innovation. So for me, when I'm talking about management research, I am particularly talking about that kind of research that leads to some form of action in order to transform the performance of managers and others, and to transform the performance of organizations. And could this be called bottom-up research? In a sense, I think it can do, because it's not done by people who've got loads and loads of time on their hand. It's not, as I say, done by people who are professional researchers. It's people who are, everyday managers who are fitting in research around all the other things that they have to do. And if we just look briefly at the action research spiral, then, when we're talking about action research, and we'll come back to this a bit later, it's simply a model where one plans to make a change, one carries out some kind of intervention, you observe, evaluate the effects of the intervention, you reflect in order to replan and start the cycle again. And we'll come back to this model a bit later on. When I was at a conference quite recently, I told you about in March, and I gave a plenary about management research. One of the things that I tried to do was to come out with a definition which was at least partly based on a definition that Simon Borg had given for teacher research. And so this was an attempt at a kind of general definition. Systematic inquiry, qualitative and/or quantitative, conducted or guided by managers, individually or collaboratively, which aims to enhance a language teaching manager's understanding of some aspects of their work or institution, and has the potential to contribute to better quality management, teaching and learning. The results of the research are made public. So that was my attempt at a general definition. So let's unpack that a bit. So management research is research done by managers about their own practices or management in general, or I'm suggesting could be research guided by managers, and the aims of the research are to improve our understanding of management and or to improve management practices. Just so it's clear, this webinar is being recorded, so you will be able to go back to the PowerPoint, and indeed if anyone does want the PowerPoint, I'm happy to make it available to them. So what I'd like to do now is just give two brief examples of ELT managers doing management research. And the first example is by Marie McCardle. And she went to a LAMSIG joint event with ACELS in Ireland a few years ago. And she presented at the conference her action research into developing a teacher appraisal system. And if you read the article, she makes it clear that this wasn't something that she'd had a lot of experience in, but she followed an action research methodology, and in consultation with her teachers came up with a teacher appraisal system. And in fact, her talk and her action research was written up in the Leadership and Management SIG newsletter. Another example comes from Keiko Sakui, and she did action research where she interviewed women managers in different parts of the world to find out from them how they had become managers and what they felt were the most important qualities for managers. And her action research was written up in ETP. And if you get to the end of the slideshow, which I sincerely do hope you get to the end of the slideshow, you will see the full reference there. So they're two short examples of ELT managers doing research. Another good example of managers doing research would be what are called feed-forward activities. And this is something that in my working life I do with many of the executives that I coach. And this is based on a book by Marshall Goldsmith, an activity from his book. And you can see this in What Got You Here Won't Get You There. And essentially, the idea is this, that a manager decides to review some aspect of their performance. It might be something that they've decided they want to improve, or indeed it might be the result of appraisal feedback, 360-degree appraisal. Anyway, the point is that the manager decides themselves to make an improvement in a particular area of their management competencies. Having chosen the area that they want to improve, they then ask staff for ideas. And the important part here is that the manager asks a question and then just shuts up and listens to the answer. So typical dialogue would be, I want to improve my performance at managing meetings effectively to make sure that, for example, everyone contributes to meetings. Any ideas what I should do? And then the other person gives an idea. The manager says, thank you. So the manager collects ideas together, and this can be done at conferences as a mingle activity, for example. And having gathered the ideas, the manager then decides to experiment. In other words, they decide to try something different in their meetings. And having tried out several of these suggestions, they then obtain feedback on their performance by staff or critical friends. And if you think about this is a very simple and I think an extremely effective way of doing research, which in this case is not only helpful to the manager, but is also once again setting the example of I am someone who listens to feedback. I am someone who wants to improve my performance. Can you help me? And can you please help me by giving me feedback on whether or not what I've done has been effective or not? So that's another example of management research. And another thing is research done by managers, for example, surveys. Pardon me. And Dan Hum and a colleague, they came up with a survey of managers in the UK, asking their opinions about CPD. And the questionnaire that they devised was something that they talked about at an English UK conference. And other examples, as you can see on the page, include people doing assignments on various management courses. Certainly there are lots of people who do ELT management modules on MA courses. You can now specialize in management on the module 3 of the New Delta, or not so New Delta in fact. You can actually write articles for the Leadership and Management SIG newsletter, and you'd make me very, very happy if you were to submit something. IATEFL Research, to a certain extent, they also have articles by managers. And I think we've seen a large number of publications in the recent past by the British Council, including, for example, one by Chris Tribble on managing change in ELT. So there is some management research going on, although, as I tried to indicate at the beginning, not as much as perhaps some of us would like. So, time for a bit of research. Over to you, Andy. We're going to do 2 quick polls. If you could pull down the first one. And basically, the question is, how important do you think it is that teachers do research? And I'm guessing that from what I can see on the screen, I can see important. The one I can't see is very important. So important 83.3%. Oh, there we go. Yeah, 16%. So, okay, we all agree then, it would seem that teachers doing research is either important or very important. Okay, thank you. Can we just try the next poll, Andy? And it's a similar question this time. The question is, roll of the drums while we wait. Just a moment. Right. So, yeah, once again, we're talking about important, very important. Thank you very much. With once again. Okay. Thank you very much for contributing. And what I'm now going to show in front of you is some research that Simon Borg did, which he wrote up in his book that he published in 2013 about teacher research, where he did actually ask managers, and you can see that the number was actually 237 managers there, whether they thought that research engagement by teachers actually had an impact on teaching quality. And in fact, it's interesting to note that probably about 60% agreed that research engagement and teaching quality were correlated. Intriguingly, he didn't ask the question whether or not managers thought management research was important. So, very quickly then, the benefits. I think it helps us to do better what we're already doing, because if you're a manager today, you've obviously got a certain number of feedback systems in place where you're getting feedback, I would suggest, from students, probably also from internal customers, for example, teachers and other staff. And I think if we established a framework for management research, this would help managers to do even better what they're doing at the moment. My next point is it is quite clearly a way of helping managers to develop themselves by, as the example I gave of a feed-forward activity, taking control of their own development and setting up systems for not only gathering evidence about their current performance, but ways in which they can improve that performance in the future. And as I've said already, it sets an excellent example to others. Oliver Goldsmith said, people seldom improve when they have no other model but themselves to copy. And in my imagination, I have this marvelous situation where it's just the managers who are going along and showing staff about the research that they have done. And within that framework, within that context, are inviting staff to do the same. There's a story I saw on the television, a program about Captain Cook, an early explorer. And in that, he had the problem of how do you get the crew to eat sauerkraut? Because sauerkraut was their way of getting vitamin C into the staff to avoid scurvy. And the fact was that it didn't taste very nice. So one of the things that Captain Cook initiated was that sauerkraut would be served at every meal that took place on the captain's table. So here are a couple of other reasons why I think management research is a good thing. It can help inform and guide institutional group data collection and analysis. That is to say, it helps managers to become aware of how they can be effective at gathering information, asking the right questions, and then analyzing the information they get. And of course, it's never been easier, I would suggest, to gather information through the use of online software, such as what you find in things like SurveyMonkey. This kind of research can provide evidence to external bodies that you are a learning organization, that you want to genuinely improve the way that you do things. And my last point is something that I'm going to mention quite briefly, and this is that it can aid decision making. Now, quite a few books have been written in the last few years, which have had similar themes. These are just two of them. On your left, you can see Dr. Steve Peters, who's a psychiatrist, and he talks about the chimp paradox. And on the right, you see a book by Daniel Kahneman, who's a psychologist, and he talks about, as the title suggests, fast and slow thinking. Now, I don't know how this is going to work as a visual aid. Here we go. That was really impressive, wasn't it? You can see my two brains, yes? Really, what they're talking about are two mental systems. Dr. Steve Peters talks about the chimp paradox and talks about the fact that we have what we might call the emotional brain that helps us to make fast decisions, particularly ones when something is life-threatening. On the other hand, we need to have the sort of human mind for making more rational, longer-term thinking. Dr. Steve Peters is a man who obviously accepts challenges, because at the moment he's working with the England football team to help them be more successful in the World Cup. Very much what I'd call a rather challenging situation to be in. Daniel Kahneman, he talks about thinking fast and slow, and he makes the point that when we think, we often think very quickly based upon instinct, intuition, or we take longer about our thoughts. Well, what's this got to do with management research? Well, I'm saying it's got quite a lot to do with it because of the impact that this has upon decision making. If you read a book by the Heath brothers, Decisive, they talk about the challenges we face when we make decisions, which surely for me is one of the key skills for managers, both individually and collectively. And these are the dangers. Firstly, narrow framing. That, in other words, we ask ourselves two simple questions like, should we get rid of this person or not? Should we open this course or not? Rather than saying things like, how can we help this person? What are the range of options that are available to us? The second point is that there is the confirmation bias that works in all human beings, including managers. And as I think Art Garfunkel sang, a man hears what he wants to hear, there should be an R in there, folks, and disregards the rest. Then we have short-term emotions, and then we have overconfidence, the fact that we tend to be overconfident about the success of something and the amount of time it will take. If you put all those together, quite often they are as a consequence of the chimp brain kind of kicking in, yeah, or the emotional brain kicking in. And what we need to do in order to find solutions to these four, let's call them problem areas, is quite often to actually use research, including number two, reality testing our assumptions. In other words, what does that mean? It means instead of asking the question, what do we think? We might ask a different question, and that question might be, what's the evidence? What's happened in the past? What certainty do we have that this will happen in the future? And another benefit is the issue of evidence-based management. Some of you, I don't know if you've heard of evidence-based medicine. Could somebody raise their hand if they've heard of evidence-based medicine? Tony has. Thank you, Tony, for that. Yes, good. To cut to the quick with this is a movement that was born out of the fact that some doctors realized that the evidence that they were getting for drugs, for example, might be biased by the fact that the trials had been carried out by the same drug companies who wanted to sell the drugs. And out of this came a whole movement which was designed to help doctors think critically about the evidence with regards to medical matters. And this has also led into evidence-based teaching that some people may well have heard of, including perhaps Tony. Would you be raising your hand again, Tony? And once again, this is a way of testing, among other things, one's own prejudices by asking the question, what is the evidence that this works? And the final point is evidence-based management. And Jeremy Pfeffer and Robert Sutton have written extensively upon the importance of making decisions upon management being based on an evidence-based approach. Now, here's a question. Should we make decisions on the basis of evidence or status? Well, I think most of us would be inclined to suggest on the basis of evidence. And yet, is that how all management decisions are based? And I think it really depends to a certain extent on the question you ask, because if you ask the question, what do you think, in a meeting, you might get a different answer to if you ask the question, well, what's the evidence? And as James Barksdale, who was a CEO himself, said, if the decision is going to be made by the facts, then everyone's facts are equal. If the decision is going to be made on the basis of people's opinions, then mine count for a lot more. And as Pfeffer and Sutton sum up, facts and evidence are great levelers of hierarchy. So, and just a couple more examples of why I think it's so important that managers do research. I think it's a necessary component of any institution claiming to be a learning organization. If we really want to take seriously this idea of being a learning organization, shouldn't research be being carried out by everybody within it, not just, for example, the teachers? And I think if we are doing research individually and collectively, this has to raise the general level of quality in the ELT sector and will help us to create effective communities of practice. Now, I got rid of most of the cartoons that I would normally use for copyright reasons, but this one I thought I'd quite liked. It says, this blog has been commented on 12 times, tweeted 22 times, and actually read 3 times. And what I'm suggesting is that through research, we can raise the quality of the communities of research, communities of practice that we belong to, where we're sharing evidence as well as sharing opinions. So, what are the conditions for language teaching management research to take place? In other words, what can we do collectively as well as individually to create a framework within which managers can carry out research in all different contexts, irrespective of which part of the world and which part of the industry that they are part of? And I'm going to borrow from an article by Simon Borg, and these were largely the ones that he provided for teacher research, and I think there's considerable overlap. Firstly, managers need to be aware of the need for management research. They need to get the reason for it, and having understood the reason, they need to be motivated to carry it out. Thirdly, they need to have the necessary knowledge and skills to carry it out effectively. Fourthly, there needs to be, I think, some choice in the matter from the point of view of the manager. And secondly, and this has been most effectively done with teachers, they need to be able to draw upon the resources of mentors to help them to carry out their research. They need to be able to create the time to do management research, and I think this would suggest that they need to find time-efficient ways of doing research. I think it would be helpful if there was greater recognition of the research done by managers. I think we ought to, or could, raise expectations. Jim Scrivener, Adrian Underhill have talked about demand high teaching. Why not demand high management? Why not having a situation where we expect all managers to carry out at least one piece of research a year? We also need a community that managers can tap into. And I would suggest we also need ways in which managers can disseminate the research that they carry out. And so, in effect, we can turn those 10 conditions into questions that we might want to discuss and explore further. So how can we help managers become aware of the kind of research available to them? How can we encourage managers to be motivated to conduct research? How can we facilitate the acquisition by managers of the necessary knowledge and skills? How do we enable managers to have choice? How can we enable managers to receive mentoring when appropriate? And you carry on with the list, turning the statements into how questions. And for example, for each of these questions, we might brainstorm what the answers might be. For example, in terms of dissemination, can report back to colleagues on some research we've done. We can write an article for a newsletter, write a blog, speak at a future management conference. And this could take several forms. It could be a talk for an hour. It could be a talk for half an hour. In fact, it would be quite easy to arrange mini slots at conferences where managers talk briefly for 10 minutes, say, about a piece of research. We could also see if we could get another Elton, which was connected to management research. And we could do what many people are trying to do at the moment, including Josh, who's on the call at the moment, as well as Andy and myself, which is establish a community of practice within which managers can carry out research and share the fruits of their research with like-minded individuals. Okay. So I'm just moving on rather quickly there to the question of a working party. And so I'd just like to invite anybody who is on the call who would be interested in joining a group to explore how we could take forward management research. I'm not quite sure if you can write your name on the screen there, but if you'd like to send me an email, then we'll see if we can get together and take things forward. Another thing which I think will be extremely helpful for managers doing their own research is to create a directory of previous management research so that there is a simple list of research resources, including a list of past research. Okay, so what's your next move? We're 40 minutes past the hour, so I'd like to move on to action research for managers, and to invite you, while we're on the call, to just think about, is there an area that you would like to do some action research in? And having identified that area of practice, think of how you might collect information, devise a strategy for change, try out the strategy, and observe its effects. And these are the kinds of areas that you might want to think of. Quite clearly, anything that's part of the, your competencies as a manager in a particular job, you could take any one of them and talk about or think about how you might enhance your competency in that area. And by the way, I don't actually believe that this has to be a weakness. I think it makes a lot of sense to actually enhance your strengths so that you create a niche for yourself as an expert in a particular area. And as you can see in front of you, there's a broad range of areas that you might want to consider. And all of these might include ways of reviewing and improving your own performance, as well as improving particular school systems. So the first step then is to identify the area that you would like to improve, and then carry out basic action research procedure. And thank you very much for that, Andy. And these are the the basic steps in the cycle. I have to say there are a number of slightly different action research models, but all of them are very similar. So firstly, to ask yourself, well, why are you doing the research? Why is this research important to you? To explore what area you're going to investigate. So to think about what's the precise question you're going to ask. In other words, how can I da 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 da. Think about what is the desired outcome of the research. Consider timing, how long you've got to carry out the research. Consider what resources you have to complete this research. To think about who can help you. Then to think about, well, what precise action, what intervention are you going to take? Think about how you're going to collect your data, your evidence, and then how are you going to report your findings? So 10 stages to go through. And thinking about the techniques, just a couple of points, of course. It's never been easier to record yourself or have yourself recorded than it is today. Very simple. For example, if you took the idea of improving your performance in meetings, very simple to set up a situation where somebody records you and so you've got a record of the meeting. And for example, in the same way as we think it's a very good idea to observe teachers on a regular basis, you could ask someone to observe you conducting the meeting, and that could be such a person as critical friend. And then also there are other ways in which you can get your data. You could interview other people, you could interview people in a focus group, or in fact you could use questionnaires. And as I said today, it's very simple to set a questionnaire up with SurveyMonkey, and they essentially do the analysis for you. So I hope at the moment, people on the call, if you're thinking of doing your own personal research, that model, that simple model, has given you some ideas about what you might want to do some research on and how to go about it. Can anybody put a hand up if they've got ideas of what they might want to do some research in? Anybody there? I've got a hand. Shirley, well done, Shirley. Martin, okay. Would someone like to put on the chat something that they'd like to do some further research in? Thank you, Anne. People are typing. Okay. Multiple attendees are typing. Okay, interesting one. Yeah. So, Martin, what motivates staff to contribute to a learning organisation? So maybe, yeah. I don't know what you've got in mind, but we could, yeah, you could have focus groups. You could have structured interviews. You could do a survey there. Yeah. Okay, Shirley, interesting one. Motivating teachers to see beyond what they teach in the classroom. Aha. Okay. And Catherine is typing, I see. One of the reasons why I think it's quite good to type away what it is you would like to do some research is this is what I would call a form of public commitment, and there's a lot of evidence from the goal setting industry that if you make a public commitment, you're far more likely to do something. So we'll see what Catherine's got to say in a moment. Here's an example, just a very simple example. A manager said, I've been interested in the motivational aspects of my work, both regarding my own motivation and that of teachers. My meetings were becoming routine, and some of my teachers seemed to find them boring. I read up about how to make meetings effective and asked colleagues to give me some ideas. I then decided to make some changes and introduce some new warmer activities at the start of the weekly academic meetings, and rearrange the order of the agenda items over a 4-week period. After doing this, I gave the teachers a questionnaire to fill in to gauge their responses to the changes. Then I gave feedback to my colleagues in a senior management seminar. So there's an example of a piece of action research, and interesting that other people have already flagged up their interest in doing something on motivation. Sharing resources and people who could help you. Quite a few people who've done the Delton will know as part of that course you actually do a motivation survey, and many of you will know that Andy Hockley wrote an article on what makes teachers tick, where he took the Hertzberg model and got a bunch of managers throughout the world to find out what makes teachers tick. So the resources are there. Okay. And as I say, one of the ideas of this particular seminar is to encourage people to share resources and to help us move forward collectively. All right. And yeah, going back over what we've looked at already, different ways of sharing your findings at the end of your action research. And I don't know how well you can see that there, but you can also come up with a simple planning tool where down here you've got the stages in the action plan, starting with planning, then reading, discussion, that's in other words getting background information, taking action, collecting your data, analyzing your data, writing up and concluding, and along the horizontal line you've got time frames. This could be week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4, week 5, week 6. And the point I want to make here is going back to the planning fallacy, that these things, like most things, do take more time than one actually imagines. So, wow, that was 49 minutes. 49 minutes seemed to be me talking. Yes, and as you can see there, Andy has shared a resource with you, which is where you can access his article, and in fact you can access it at the LAMSIG website. Excellent. What I've put on the screen in front of you are many of the books that I referred to, or articles that I referred to in the last 50 minutes, and I'll just keep that slide up there. And once again, highlight the fact that if you go to the LAMSIG website, you will see a small number of articles which are connected to management research. Okay, so questions, comments. Anybody like to write something? I can see Anne is in the business of writing. Excellent, yes. Thank you, Anne, for your favourable comments about the website. Any other questions? I'm interested to know if people are interested in going about, setting up a framework, setting up an ELT management directory. Great. Fantastic. So if people are interested, then if you drop me a line at georgeuk32@aol.com, then I'll see how we can, and invite you to see how we can take things forward. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you. And Ian as well. Hello, Ian. Ian wrote to me, you're doing a course at the moment, aren't you, Ian? So good luck with your course. I'm just waiting to see if we can get any other comments coming through. Okay, so Anne is doing the course at the moment. Yes, absolutely fine, Anne. Yes, good. Well, you'll be doing some research anyway, won't you, in the near future? Excellent, good. Hi there, Neil. Thank you, Neil. Yes, excellent. Well, I hope what I've done is demystify management research a little bit, making it clear that it is very manageable, and to a certain extent, it's formalizing what we already do. And also that if we work together to create a community of practice where we can draw upon shared expertise and shared resources, we should make it easier for people in the future to carry out management research. Okay. I'm just going to pause to see if anybody else is writing. No. So I think I'll just move on to small changes and marginal gains. If you see those two sentences, it's time to eat, mother, and it's time to eat, mother. There's very little difference between the two. In fact, there's a comma, a pause, but the meaning is very different. I think if managers could just take the time to pause, reflect, and do research just a little bit more frequently than they do at the moment, I think this could lead to tremendous gains in terms of not only how we perform individually as managers, but how we perform at the organizational level. So I would just like to thank you all for coming along to this talk on a Thursday afternoon, when, as I said at the beginning, you're all very busy people. Thank you. Andy,
yes,
over to you.
For coming. And thank you, George, for a really interesting and useful talk, I think. And I think it was, I hope that it was as useful to everybody else as it was to me. I do apologise for the slight, the fact that you couldn't see the chat window until halfway through when I realised that you couldn't see it. But hopefully it didn't impact your enjoyment of the talk. So thanks to everyone for coming, and again, thank you, George, for your time and for this really interesting presentation.
And thank you very much to you, Andy. Okay, thank you for dropping in, everybody, and look forward to seeing you at a training event, at a conference, or online in the future. Over and out. Thank you very much.